Alright, so I gotta lay out the premise for this first because this is something else. Initially, this was supposed to be the round table versus Charlemagne and his paladins because I've been wanting to see that myself and I had a bunch of people asking me to do that. However, after further examination and looking into Charlemagne's lineup, Charlemagne, Astolfo, Roland, Bradamante, I'm realizing that the Knights of the Round Table would run through Charlemagne's team. Let's be honest. And if I get to moving things around, then it's not going to be fair to the Knights of the Round. So I just got to remap that whole fight and make it more suitable. Maybe wait until some more paladins show up, because with that lineup, that's not it. Another conversation that we were having on the round table video is how stacked the Argonauts are. You would think the Knights of the Round would be the pinnacle, right? Some of the best knights to ever exist. Literally the quintessential warrior. You look at the lineup for the Argonauts and it almost seems unfair. Heracles, Medea, Achilles, Asclepius, Canis, Atalanta, and this doesn't even count the Dioscuri, plus some others. So that's the one that we're gonna roll with instead. We're gonna use Knights of the Round Table versus the Argonauts. For this fight specifically, we're gonna swap out Saber for the Lion King for a couple of reasons. One of them is that I just did Saber in the other video, so I don't want to run the same matchups into the ground. I don't want to put Saber in because then I'm gonna have to give her Avalon, and then they're just gonna win by default. Because ultimately, no matter what happens, everything is just gonna boil down to her having Avalon. So I really don't want to put it in a position where she no-sells their whole team. So it's gonna be the starting 5 of the round table: Lion King, Lancelot, Gawain, Mordred, Tristan, and considering what we just learned in Einherjar, we're gonna throw in Percival. Not giving them their gifts because it's OD, it's unnecessary. And they're gonna be going up against Heracles, Achilles, Atalanta, Asclepius, Canis, and Medea. Achilles doesn't have his LB armor. Heracles is in his archer form. He was just an archer before he turned into Alcides. I'm gonna bar Dioscuri because they're literally 2 people for one, and then they have authorities and we know a lot less about them. Everybody here is a well-seasoned fighter. They're more than willing to jump out into the open, but they don't necessarily have to. The most important thing is to get some type of momentum going and then follow that up by establishing some type of advantage. So 2 of the most brash fighters from the Argonauts decide that they're going to lead the way into the battle, that being Canis and Achilles. The fight is right outside the gates of Camelot, right in the fields. Everything is just barren wasteland. So you got Achilles and Canis trying to charge in. Tristan takes the front. He starts to make an attempt to shoot them down. Immediately, Medea comes in and puts out a barrier that deflects his shots and also follows them while they're closing in. Tristan then starts to shoot multiple shots at Medea to ward her off and make her release her spell. This goes into our first matchup, Tristan and Medea. Her main thing is that without a proper setup, she's trying to conserve as much energy as possible. But Tristan's shots are too dangerous. She has to go in a bit early. So she starts to beam spam him back, similar to the fight that she had with Emiya. She also doesn't plan to waste any time with Dragon Tooth warriors because they're fodder and she knows there's no humans here. He realizes that he could just waste her energy if he keeps dodging her beams. This would put him and his team at a good advantage. At the same time, he doesn't want to risk being hit by one of these beams and make things worse. So since she's in the air and she has no intentions on coming down, he's opting on using his Phantasm, if nothing else, to at least slow her down. So he primes up his Phantasm, fail not, the move that of course never misses his target, nowhere for her to run. He lets go of his Phantasm at Medea, and what he begins to realize is that Medea has substitution spells. We've seen this before multiple times in Stay Night. She will often just replace herself with a shadow clone, and Medea has now popped up right behind him. Now something else Medea is capable of is that she can transport her targets at will. We've seen her do this to Shiro flat out. So the moment she teleports behind him, she grabs Tristan on the shoulder and then transports him into the air. countless kilometers into the sky and then goes back to the ground. Now Tristan can't fly in any way, shape, or form, so he's stuck, free falling. And the reason that Medea did this is because under him she's beginning to charge her Age of Gods level fireball, which would mean he would fall directly into a pseudo sun. He's got to make something shake fast. With nothing else at his disposal but his bow, he starts firing his bow as much as he possibly can, and the shots themselves were propelling him out of the way of the energy ball, just enough to edge him out from getting hit by it. To which at that point, the Lion King's horse starts to come around to catch him as he's nearly about to hit the ground. The Lion King has already gotten off of her horse and she's motioning to make a move against Medea. The moment that she's about to tag her, Achilles dashes in from the side to stop the king. He realizes that something is wrong. The sheer force of magical energy behind her Rongomeniad launches Achilles all the way back into the field, despite him being the one that stopped her. Again, the teams don't know about each other's abilities, so in that moment Achilles has no idea why this happened to him. He tries to go in for a response and then he gets hit by Lancelot. This goes into our second fight, Achilles versus Lancelot. They go head up in close combat, Achilles being the one with the advantage. Lancelot is the pinnacle of human skill, but Achilles has power and speed that trumps him in close range. Now we know that Achilles has this condition of divinity. You have to be at least divine or have something of divine construct level to harm him, and that's just the thing. Guess who just so happens to have a divine construct? So Lancelot gets his phantasm off and slices Achilles through the chest, which he just believes to be a regular strike. He doesn't make a big deal about it at first, and in that moment, overload. It blows up his chest. This leaves Achilles wounded and on alert. It also had him infuriated to the point where he kicked Lancelot all the way across the field. At this point, he didn't want to risk taking another hit, so now he's opting for using his chariot, which, as we know, his chariot is extremely fast. The moment Achilles is about to come down, you have Gawain from the back tossing up his galantine while invoking its power. Lancelot catches the galantine right before Achilles comes down and releases the phantasm at him. Different times throughout the series, we've seen divine constructs lent to other servants. We've seen Achilles do this with Orion, he did it with Astolfo, and we've even seen Artoria do this with Bedivere. What's happening here is no different. Due to his connection to this type of blade, him literally being the Knight of the Lake, he can actually use the weapon because of his background. So he releases Galantine's heat wave, and at the very last minute, Achilles pulls his chariot out of the way up towards the sky. This came to no surprise for Lancelot because he was never trying to hit Achilles in the first place. This was merely a distraction. After Lancelot released the Galantine, he threw it back to Gawain, and then Gawain released it while Achilles was going up into the sky to avoid the first one. Another thing to point out is that this is in broad daylight, so there's not a time where Gawain will be stronger. His power is currently being amplified by the sun, and he hits the chariot of Achilles directly and knocks him out of the sky. Now we know that Achilles has 3 horses, 2 of them being divine and immortal, but one of his horses are actually mortal. Gawain completely annihilated this normal horse, so now he's down to only 2. And while he could keep using his chariot, naturally the speed has now been reduced. So at this point, it's more so of a standoff of Achilles trying to figure out how to move forward after being wounded and losing one of his horses. We switch over to Mordred going up against Atalanta. We've already had something similar when we had Mordred going up against Chiron and Apocrypha. Right now she's deflecting several of Atalanta's arrows, Atalanta doing her best to keep the distance between them and try to cause some fatal damage. She constantly slows Mordred down. Then she starts to reinforce her shots even more, which causes Mordred to come to a halt. The reinforcement made it more difficult for Mordred to knock him down. Then Atalanta releases her phantasm, Phoebus Catastrophe, which is a known barrage that literally minced Spartacus into pieces. With Mordred being stuck in one spot from the last arrow, she's kinda in a position where she has to just deal with it. She doesn't want to waste her phantasm too early, so she decides to just go in for deflecting. In that moment, Percival comes in right behind her, and in Kingdom Hearts fashion, they start deflecting every single arrow that Atalanta put out towards them. Percival covering her back while Mordred was covering his, and they're just knocking these arrows down incessantly. They get through the barrage, and she's about to release her phantasm. She gets blindsided by Canis, who literally speed blitzed her out of nowhere. So Mordred is sent flying across the field. Canis catches her while she's still midair and starts to faceplant her through the ground while they're traveling. They come to a stop, and Mordred is beyond pissed. She feels crazy disrespected, so she just starts going off. She immediately jumps up and starts throwing all these hits at Canis, and Canis is just barely managing to block them. Even though she's stronger than Mordred, Mordred is just in a rage right now. Eventually, she managed to get a clean hit off at Canis' side. Then Heracles shows up. He began to realize that this might be an issue for Canis, or at least he didn't want it to get there, so he decides to shoot out a barrage of arrows at Mordred and Percival. The barrage, however, wasn't like Phoebus' catastrophe, where it had a large area of effect. Heracles shot this barrage straight at them, so they managed to get out the way. And right before they could get proper footing, you had Canis summoning her Maelstrom Phantasm, essentially a wave that they couldn't avoid. Percival is wondering how they should go about it, and the two of them agree to take it head on. He steps up beside Mordred, and they both use their phantasm together to blow a hole straight through it. Her phantasm still came down, but the part that would have hit them had a large opening, and the combined forces of their phantasm hit Canis head on, leaving her with fatal damage. Heracles is about to step in again to give her backup when he realized that she was already launching her next phantasm, Golden Wings, where she literally transforms into a phoenix and swoops down out of the sky. And she swoops down and rams both Mordred and Percival at the same time. And now she's getting exhausted, but at least she's got them down. Now they're fatally wounded. And since she's on land, her authority isn't helping her nearly as much. As soon as she landed from her phantasm, she hears something charging in the background. Fail not. And Tristan shoots her directly through the chest from behind. Now that Canis has been eliminated, you got Atalanta and Heracles trying to jump Tristan. He's being overwhelmed and he has to regroup before it's too late. He makes his way through the field trying to create distance. We know he has experience with this from Camelot, him being jumped by 100 Face, Cursed Arm Hassan, and Serenity, but the Hassans are nowhere near that level. This won't last him that long. He keeps turning to shoot back at them, but all of these shots are failing. Of course, his normal shots don't have the condition of his phantasm. They either keep getting knocked down by colliding arrows, or they're just missing altogether. One thing about Tristan is that his bow is an actual harp, and that he can weave his shots together. What appeared to be Tristan just missing over and over again was him literally weaving a trap around Heracles and Atalanta to slow them down and get away. He takes advantage of this by going back for his teammates, Mordred and Percival. Another thing about Tristan is that his harp has healing properties, specifically allowing him to heal mental disturbance. As a result of them being fatally wounded, naturally Mordred and Percival are shooken up. Tristan heals them both mentally to have them go past their body's limits. The moment he gets finished, Tristan lifts up into the sky. This was not of his own doing. He was impaled through the chest by Asclepius and tossed into the air. Asclepius has access to a mechanical snake that allows for long-range manipulations. Normally, Tristan might have been able to shake back from this, but the problem here was that Asclepius is a god of medicine. He's ranked EX in the skill, and he also has item creation EX. What Asclepius had done was rub the end of his snake with poison prior to the attack. By lore, Tristan has a weakness to poison. This was something completely unknown to Asclepius. He was only trying to make the attack more effective. Needless to say, this weakness took Tristan out of the picture. So now it's down to 5v5. The Argo being down Canis and the Knights of the Round being down Tristan. Going back to Asclepius's EX god of medicine, his phantasm is a resurrection spell. It's also noted that that this phantasm is incomplete and can only be used a certain number of times. In order for him to revive a human, he would have to jump through way more hoops and hurdles. But servants are ghosts. It would be nothing for him to bring back a fallen teammate. He uses this on Canis and brings her back to life. Canis immediately goes in to finish the job she had against Percival and Mordred and crosses them out both at the same time. Now it's 6v3. The Lion King, who's in another battle altogether, out of rage for her fallen comrades, the Lion King unleashes her first Rongo Miniad directly for Asclepius and Canis. And even though Medea tried to clear the way to do something about it, their entire bodies were incinerated in one strike. Now it's 4v3. Gawain, Lancelot, and the Lion King are the only ones left. The Argonauts have them completely surrounded, giving them no chance to decide on a response. Achilles immediately takes to his chariot, bringing Atalanta along with him. Heracles once again unleashes a barrage of arrows towards them from the ground, Atalanta shooting them all from the chariot above ground. So you got arrows coming from the sky as well as coming from the side from Heracles. They're moving as quick as they can, but they have to do something about this. Lancelot decides to go after Heracles. He's knocking down the arrows from Heracles with no problem and starts to straight up catch the arrows from Heracles mid-flight and then threw them back towards him. Doing this a number of times, he was finally able to catch back up. He gets point blank to Heracles and puts Arundite to his side. Heracles managed to catch Arundite with his bare hands. He knees Lancelot in the stomach and then shoots him across the field. He also snatched the sword from Lancelot when he shot him. Right after that, Overload activated and it killed Heracles, taking one of his lives. Keyword being one. Heracles has God hand. Ultimately, he has to be killed 12 times. Lancelot is confused why his best shot didn't take Heracles out completely, but he continues nonetheless. After he rejuvenates, Heracles jumps up into the sky and starts to fire a countless amount of shots at Lancelot under him. The smoke clears away only for Heracles to realize that Lancelot was already in the air right beside him. He grabs Heracles by the leg and throws him directly into the ground. He takes this time to recover his sword. Then we switch over to Gawain and the Lion King. Right now they're still fending off Atalanta's arrows without flaw, dodging and deflecting as much as they can. Suddenly, Medea teleports right next to Gawain and begins to strengthen him in the same way that she did with Kazuki. He tries to make a swipe at her with his sword, too slow. He only hits one of her clones. At first he was confused as to why she would do this, and then he saw what came after. She teleports behind him on the other side and hits him with Rule Breaker, completely nullifying not only her buff, but the other buff that she noticed he was getting from the sun as well. Medea herself has already admitted that Rule Breaker doesn't work directly on phantasms, but for skills like Numeral of the Saint, which is his sun buff, that's a different story. Now that his sun buff is disabled, Gawain has been weakened and he can only rely on his Galantine. She flies back laughing and then she starts to beam spam him. Initially he was going to jump back to safety, but Gawain decided to do the exact opposite. He high jumps around several beams and then speed blitz her right after she decided to do this and manages to wound her. Even Medea was surprised that he would make the attempt. Now that Medea has been slowed down, the Lion King directs her focus towards her and releases a surprise Rongo Miniad, completely incinerating her. At this point, with Lancelot being one of the last alive, he decided that he needed to regroup. So he's running back towards his team, fending off Heracles while he does so. He never wanted to separate to begin with, but he thought at the very least he could spin things into a more favorable circumstance. They link back up. Atalanta, realizing the weight of the situation, decides to use her pelt to turn into her berserker form. Again, this comes at the cost of a shift in her character, her sanity. And then she starts unloading at the three of them with even stronger shots than before. Atalanta is an incredible bowmaster. Knocking away her shots before wasn't that big of a deal, but now that she's being reinforced by the magical energy of her pelt, it's not something that they want to risk contact with. Even deflecting them at this point will cause damage, so everybody is doing their best to stay out of the way. Two enormous shots cause Gawain to get separated. Heracles immediately takes advantage of this by sending out his own barrage of arrows at Gawain as well. With no one currently covering his back, Gawain opts to using his Galantine phantasm to knock away the barrage of arrows that Heracles sent out. From behind, you have Atalanta drilling down in a cyclone, moving straight towards Gawain. Again, Gawain has been nerfed. He's already wounded. He has nowhere else to go. He decides to take her on too. He spins around for another Galantine. She put everything she had into this drill to make sure that he goes down. And in turn, she sacrificed herself for the double KO. Seeing this, Achilles hops off of his chariot. Now we're down to the Lion King and Lancelot versus Achilles and Heracles. The reason that Achilles has been very cautious of getting close to the Lion King is that he can tell that something is up with that spear, and he's not wrong. Not only is Rongo a divine construct, but unlike Lancer Artoria, the Lion King actually has divinity in her kit, so she could truly harm Achilles if she wanted to despite his buff. And considering the weapon being Rongo, it's the last weapon that you would want to be harmed with. The Lion King finally gets back off her steed. She too has been conserving energy for times like this. She's been opting for her Rongo Miniot, but again, Rongo Miniot is a divine construct. Its energy is its own thing. Achilles tries to offer her a 1v1 via his reality marble, but she declines, thinking it might be a trap. At the end of the day, she's still King Arthur. She starts to speed blitz Heracles out of nowhere. All over the field, she's pressing the issue, trying to knock him down with her lance. He's constantly throwing shots to fend her off, and she just keeps knocking them down and continues behind him. He jumped up, she jumped up with him. He released an arrow point blank, and she just ate it by colliding it with her lance. Switching back over to Lancelot and Achilles, they're already engaging in a one-on-one. Now you have Achilles being cautious about getting hit by Lancelot's Arndite again. The last time he got hit, it was through the chest, but Lancelot could very easily hit him in the leg, which in turn could cause damage that's closer to his heel. He disengages with Lancelot, and then he starts to prioritize his speed more, at a rate that he can't even discern it. Lancelot jumps back out of the circle, and what should have been Achilles knocking him to the ground was him only hitting Lancelot's after image. Unfortunately, Lancelot is fast, but he's not nearly as fast as Achilles. He flashes behind Achilles, and Lancelot hits his after image, and then Achilles appears from below and kicks him even further into the sky. Achilles drops down to the ground. One thing that he's been trying to avoid this entire time was revealing the telekinetic powers of his spear. In that moment, he instantly throws his spear through Lancelot, hitting his core and completely wiping him out of the picture. We switch back over to the Lion King, and she's still overwhelming Heracles. With her constantly speed blitzing, he can't get into position to get off his shots. In that same moment that Lancelot is getting taken out, the Lion King starts to sense the sheer amount of power coming from Heracles. Of course, he's charging his 9 Lives phantasm. She retaliates by charging another Rongo Miniot. 9 Lives and Rongo Miniot go head at it, but ultimately Rongo swallows 9 lives, and the rest of the energy went towards Heracles, taking one of his lives. He can't afford to get hit by the full thing. The Lion King is now down to her last Rongo. She senses that Achilles is coming full speed behind her to try to help Heracles. Before he manages to get there, she had already charged her Rongo once again. She turns around and unleashes this at Achilles as well. Turns out Heracles was the one that jumped in front of this attack, and in a similar fashion to Lost Belt 2, he sacrificed himself for Achilles by taking the majority of the hit, using the lives of God Hand to absorb most of the attack. However, the power of Rongo isn't something that somebody could just take, so even Heracles sacrificing himself still wouldn't be enough to stop it, which is why Achilles came behind him with this shield phantasm. The shield, as we know, has been said to be equated to an entire world. It can completely absorb most attacks and can also be used for retaliation. So all the residual energy that Heracles didn't take, Achilles was now absorbing this into his shield. This also kept him at a safe distance from the Lion King. Heracles is wiped out, out, Achilles lifts up the shield full of energy, and in that moment that the Lion King realized what happened, he boomeranged the shield directly towards her, cutting her head smooth off of her body. The shield being charged with the equivalent of Rongo Minia's energy. And then the shield returned back to Achilles' hand. Game over, Argonauts win.